Okay, as they enter, I'm going to get started. Good afternoon. My name is Amber Harrison. I'm the Housing Innovation Manager for York Community Service Association and the local health officer for the town of York. I want to welcome you to our fourth housing seminar. In this hour, we hope you learn about how you can leverage zoning changes into housing opportunities in our community. I want to thank you for taking the time to join us today. This housing seminar is brought to you by a joint grant received from Maine Housing by York Community Service Association here in York. And I believe the executive director, Michelle Sertival, is here. If you could wave, Michelle, thank you. In conjunction with Fairtide and Kittery, and the executive director, Emily Flinkstrom, is also there. She is. Welcome. The Housing Navigator pilot program is a 2-year project established by the legislature through LD 1733. The navigators for this program work with families experiencing or at risk of homelessness and obtaining housing and assisting them in maintaining stable housing following lease-up. The 3 major components of the Housing Navigator pilot program are: number 1, landlord engagement; number 2, pre-tenancy assistance to families; and 3, housing stability services. Today, we will cover the types of zoning regulations related to housing and those that are being proposed at the state and municipal levels, with the goal of giving you the tools and terms to advocate for the development of affordable housing, which may include the creation of your own accessory dwelling units or retrofitting housing and/or commercial spaces. To make sure we are helping you as best we can on our webinar, we have collected your questions at registration. I've shared those questions with our speakers who will do their best to weave them into their presentations. You can also go to create a rental unit via the YCSA website. You can sign up online, and there are openings available on my calendar. You can always send me an email or give a call here as well. This webinar will be available on York's Public Library's YouTube channel, as well as on YCSA's Housing Solutions Library, where we have put all of our previous webinars, as well as repeated on the town's public access television channel. I want to introduce our speakers. Our first speaker will be Eliot Feldman. He is the Director of Land Use and Planning at Southern Maine Regional Planning and Development Commission. Eliot is an experienced planning director with a demonstrated history of working in government administration industry and has worked with many Southern Maine communities on their comprehensive plans, zoning amendments, and feasibility studies. Eliot will be highlighting the variety of housing-related LDs that were discussed, proposed, and recently voted on by the legislature. Our second speaker is Peter Joseph, the town manager in York. Peter is a veteran public administrator who had been the town manager in Freeport for the last 10 years. And before that, he was the town manager in Lincoln, New Hampshire for 4 years. Peter will be talking about the housing and zoning changes as they relate to the housing crisis, specifically here in Southern Maine. And our third and final speaker is Christine Bennett, Eliot's Planning Board Chair and co-chair of the Eliot Comprehensive Plan Update Committee. Christine is a strong and knowledgeable supporter of municipalities working to address the housing crisis and an advocate in the legislature that assists municipalities to go beyond modifying land use regulations regarding housing to address housing supply and provide a meaningful tool to address affordability. So with that, I'd like to hand it over to Eliot to start off the discussion. Thank you so much for joining us, Eliot.
There we go. Thank you, Amber. I appreciate the ask to participate in this program. I think it's worthwhile. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining in. And so one of the things that I was specifically really asked to talk about that Amber already mentioned is, what are some of the housing legislative pieces coming down the line for the upcoming session, and what are some of the things that are already approved that we need to look to and work on. So I've got a couple of those, and some of them actually get a little outside the housing initiative directly, but I think could have a major impact within the next couple of years as it relates to municipalities and how you look at housing and other development pieces. So as we know, LD 2003 had 3 component parts to it. The accessory dwelling unit piece, the what I call 2 to 4 unit piece, and the affordable housing development piece. And the one piece that will affect every municipality is the accessory dwelling unit piece. And that basically allows any household in any residential zoning area that exists to have at least one accessory dwelling unit. The dwelling unit can be located in the existing home, it can be attached to the existing home, or it can be freestanding on the property as long as you can meet all of the setback requirements that the town's zone has. Now, in doing that, that's probably the easiest, what I will call affordable housing piece for people to have, although there is no affordable housing incentive tied to that piece. It's merely getting people to be able to have additional units on their property, which in hopes will bring prices of housing down because of the number of units that can become available over time. The 2 to 4 unit piece is probably, in my estimation, the most complicated of the law, in the sense that you're talking about allowing 2 units or up to 4 units on a vacant piece of property. And there's a provided that, and it's the way the towns will draft their ordinances, provided that you have enough land. And so, for example, if you have a zone that allows a single family home on 1 acre, if you want to have a second unit on that vacant piece, you're probably going to have at least up to 2 acres. And I say that because every town is going to be different. Some towns are going to say, well, we're only going to allow an additional ½ acre for the next unit and additional ½ acre for additional units beyond that. Or they could say, well, for every unit, we're going to require an additional full acre, whatever the zoning may be, to allow that. And that's kind of like the whole in-between piece. One of the challenges with that piece is that I'm seeing is going to occur is how we review and how we treat new subdivisions coming into communities. Because if you have a 1 acre zone in the subdivision and a developer comes forward and has 2 acre lots, does that mean that they're going to want to put 2 independent residential housing units on each lot? And if they are, what are the impacts that could occur from stormwater and from traffic primarily? But it's also an opportunity to double the size or even go up to quadruple the size in some communities, the number of housing units that are available. Again, there's no incentive tied to that piece as far as affordable housing goes. But again, it will help develop additional housing units on a parcel of land. Then there's the affordable housing development piece, which is the real affordable housing piece, in the sense that it's going to incentivize a developer that if you're in the right location being having public water or sewer available, and being in a growth area of a municipality that has a consistent comprehensive plan with the state law, then you can get 2.5 times the density of whatever the base zone is in that area that allows multifamily housing development to occur. And in doing that, in return, the developer has to guarantee through various mechanisms that at least 50% of those units will maintain affordability over a 30-year period. And that's the real affordable housing piece. And it doesn't have to be rental units. They can be condominium, it can be a residential subdivision meeting those standards. It can be any type of housing. So I think that's where the real affordability piece comes in. Now, what I just mentioned in that aspect is that not every town is eligible for that. And some towns will only be eligible for the ADU piece, or most towns will be eligible for the ADU piece. The affordable housing piece, you have to have public water or sewer. And there's a Christine may talk about that in her section, but there's a very gray area as to defining that still exists in the law. This law still has challenges about it. And we can certainly talk about that if there's time. But you have to have the public water, public sewer piece. You have to be in a growth area that's consistent with the comprehensive plan, and or you have to be in a HUD designated, I call it a growth area. It's a HUD designated area that meets federal standards. Not all communities have that, and we at SMPDC have mapped those areas to understand which communities are going to have to deal with which piece of the law, because we are on the front lines of that. For many of the communities that don't have planning staff, they contact us and ask us to draft their ordinances for them to bring them into compliance. I'll kind of veer away from LD 2003 in the effort of time a little bit, but there have been some other pieces of legislation. There's actually been, I don't want to exaggerate, but I'd almost say hundreds of pieces of legislation that have been submitted that either try to amend this law or do other things to address the law. A couple of them that are the more notable pieces was LD 1706. That was an effort to clarify some of the language in the law, but also to extend the time frame that municipalities had to put their ordinances in place, because every town was supposed to have these ordinances amended or drafted to be in place by June of this past June 2023. Many municipalities just could not meet that deadline. So they went back to the legislature with this LD 1706, and it basically says, if you have a form of government that has a select board or a council that can approve ordinance amendments, then you have to be in compliance by, I'll say December of this year. Probably it's actually January 1 of 24. And if you have a town meeting form of government, you'll have until June of 2024 to get your ordinances in place. And the purpose of that differential is because these smaller towns that have only town meeting form of government and only meet once or maybe twice a year, you have to start very early in the process to get the ordinance developed, to go through public hearings, to have the select board make their recommendations, and then get it on the warrant. And not every town meets in June. Some towns meet in March, April, May. So it's been very tricky trying to maneuver this from our standpoint to help these municipalities get into compliance with that. I'll just leave it with the reason I talk about getting into compliance is because Maine is a home rule state. I'm not sure if all of you know that or realize what that is, but a home rule state basically says, here's the base of the state law. And if you want to be more restrictive or do something different within the confines of that municipality, you can do that. This legislation basically dictated to municipalities that you shall do X, Y, and Z. So all of these municipalities have been scrambling to try and get their ordinances in place and make things work. LD 214 was to limit this law, the LD 2003 law, to municipalities with over 10,000 population. That came out of conference dead on arrival, so it never went to the full legislature for any action. LD 665, I can't remember the specifics of 665, but that did come out of committee, ought not to pass. So that was probably dead on arrival with the full legislature as well. Christine's shaking her head. She may be able to address that a little better than I can. Tracking all of these bills has been difficult. As I said, there were like hundreds of them. LD 1672 was put back into committee, and it's being held over for this legislative session. And LD 1672 is one to watch because what it could do is establish a statewide planning board, if you will, and projects that want to have the affordability can bypass the municipality and go to this board for approval, which basically cuts the local municipality out of any review or say as to whether or not it's an appropriate development to be located in the town. So we'll see where that goes. I'm sure that's going to be heavily debated during this next legislative session. LD, that's the one 672, which is I just mentioned. The other one that is not on a lot of people's radar right now is LD 1976. 1976 is basically a complete overhaul of the growth management law. And it will change the way municipalities look at their municipality from a comprehensive planning and growth management strategy. And completely, in my estimation, it completely guts what we currently have and have used for years for growth management and looking at our municipality from that standpoint. I won't go into the details. It's a fairly lengthy bill. It's 26 pages long and addresses a number of issues, but that is one to watch going forward. The only other thing that I would bring up at this point, and I'm a little more fascinated in it than anything, is that the whole issue of ARUs, which are the accessory residential units, which is different than the regular ADU unit because it's more for the medical aspect of encouraging development for folks that may have some sort of handicap needs or those things. I haven't heard a lot about those in my work, but I am fascinated to hear more about that. The other issue that kind of is dangling out there that some municipalities are tackling and others really have not seen any need to at this point is the whole issue of tiny homes and how do tiny homes fit into the affordable housing realm. And I've got some thoughts and ideas about that. And I'd be happy to answer that during a question and answer period because I think I'm close to my time limit anyway. So I'm going to pass it back to Amber and we'll move on.
Thank you, Lee J. Actually, before you mute yourself, I did have a couple things that was to add. I know you and I had spoken about ARUs. York does have them in their zoning ordinance. While I was the director there, I think I maybe had 5 in a 10 or 11-year period apply. Very low-hanging fruit for folks, though, to simply apply based on age, disability, or illness that you are able to create a unit within or attached to or on your property, and it doesn't affect your density. It is one of those things that kind of circumnavigates the idea that you now have a separate dwelling unit. You actually have 2 units in one where you can have a caregiver unit, but it counts as a single family dwelling under the assessor's categories. So that has some tax value for people to consider, and I'd be happy to discuss more ARUs if anyone wanted to at another time. One other question I had for you was about the maximum size of ADUs at 750. I know in New York it used to be larger. About 10 years ago, we voted to change it to 750. They were growing, and now there's push to increase it again. So I wasn't sure, housing a family in an ADU could be difficult of 750 square feet. And so I wanted to ask your thoughts on anything to do with maybe maximizing or getting a larger number there.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great question. Thanks for asking that because it is something that I see that's all over the board. In the sense that that's one of those local control issues that towns still have in developing ADUs is that the state law says that the ADU size minimum is 140 square feet, and that's because of building code requirements and the like. But municipalities are everywhere on this. Some municipalities have gone, in fact, I'm working with one right now that wants to go to 900 square feet for an accessory dwelling unit, which is a pretty good size unit. But, we just did a walkthrough of a 900 square foot unit over a garage. And it makes a lot of sense to go that large, even as a 1-bedroom unit. Others have said no larger than 50% of their primary residential unit. And some have gone as low as 600 and below the 750 mark that you talked about, Amber. So it's kind of all over the board. And I would definitely encourage people to do some research on that before they settle on anything, because There are pluses and minuses to looking at all of that. The other aspect of that I would mention while I have the floor is that one of the things that is not in the law, and a lot of municipalities that are working with me have asked, is if someone that owns the primary residence wants to downsize and move into the ADU and rent the larger home, can they do that? And the answer is yes. So if you're a single elder person and need one floor and you want to build an ADU, but you want to maintain the house as income, which would get you more income because it's a larger unit for a family, you can do that. It ought to just be written into the local ordinance that you're encouraging that or allowing that. But it's certainly not out of the realm of possibility for folks to do that.
Great, thank you. I know in New York it does say 50% of the maximum of the size of the Maine, but a maximum of 750 square feet. And as we talked about, organizing that space for a family might be difficult, but it's good to hear it's under local control. And we may circle back, Lee J. Thank you. That was very informative. One of the things that we had brought up, you and I discussing before, that I have some concern over too, is the how to maintain affordability over a 30 to 50 year span, and who is checking that, because we're creating all these units, pumping them out into the market and wondering, is there an organization at the state level or even a municipal level to be making sure that they remain affordable in 10, 20, 30 years. So that is a question and concern that I'd like to pose to the group and keep pushing up to legislators to consider as you make these. We need to make sure there are folks watching to make sure they remain affordable too. So thank you, Lee J. I think we're going to move to Peter Joseph next, the town manager of York. Thank you, Peter.
Hi, Amber. Hi, everyone. You guys hear me okay? Am I good volume-wise? Great. Sorry for the contrast. I keep going light and dark based on the lighting here, and I don't know how to fix it. So if I blank out here, I apologize. So yeah, really interesting listening to Lee J's updates on some of the other things surrounding LD 2003. But I just want to delve a little bit into the history of that. And a lot of people may not know this, but LD 2003 was, the big, the housing law that we've been talking about mostly for the beginning of this meeting, but kind of why it came about. And I think it was a response, well, it certainly was a response to zoning being used. There are cases here in Maine and a lot of locations where zoning has been used by municipalities as an exclusionary tool, right? So we look at zoning, and the original intent of zoning, or the current stated claims of zoning in most places, are to protect people, from certain situations occurring, like having, a residential neighborhood right next to a coal mining plant, or a industrial facility that releases gas and, vapors, noises, all those kind of things. So, that's the kind of protective part of zoning. But there is a little bit of history there where zoning has been used as an exclusionary tool in the past, and especially for income levels, right, demographically. And that's really what LD 2003 was getting at, was that history of minimum lot sizes or minimum house sizes, setting a bar over which to live in a community you have to be able to hurdle, which could be a very expensive bar, right? And that could be used. And there are, anecdotal examples of that happening in Maine in exclusive communities. Happy to say that's not the history of how it's been used here in New York, maybe unintentionally by having lot sizes that are a certain size. But there are communities even now that are before LD 2003 happened, that were monkeying around with density and raising things. So it was more difficult and more expensive to get into a community. Some of the residential communities between here and Portland, where this was LD 2003, was kind of seen as it really was an infringement on that kind of home rule authority that most municipalities have taken as gospel, that here in Maine, we can make our own zoning, we can make our own standards. If we want to be exclusive and have 5-acre zoning and really expensive houses, well, we can do that because we're the municipality. But the state, the legislature pushed back a little bit with 2003, which I think was fair. And so that's great, but we have to, these things, the affordability, the density, the accessory dwelling units, these are things that we don't want you to have the ability essentially to infringe, which because it really affects the provision of affordable housing or different housing types. So now everybody is under the same, and I think it's really encouraging to see that it's applying to everybody. They're not just carving out specific sizes of municipalities, like everyone over 10,000 or everyone over 5,000. That's the way the building code has been enforced throughout the years with MUBEC. If you were over a certain size, you didn't have to, you had to follow the rules, but small towns didn't have to. So it's great to kind of see that. There is an example that was kind of shown to me jokingly, but even here in York, in the past, zoning was first implemented. One of the first places when there were the village corporations that made the individual village neighborhoods. There's a narrated history of how zoning was. It's obviously from a very specific point of view, but how zoning was put in place in the York Harbor. To protect the nice area of York Harbor from encroachment from undesirable uses, specifically campgrounds. So the areas that are the campgrounds that are kind of between Long Sands and the harbor at the time. Camp Eaton was the one at the time that was a concern to all the people in the harbor that was going to spread in the early 1900s, and there would be essentially tourists and poor people that would be infringing onto their nice beautiful neighborhoods. So that's one of the reasons that pushed zoning implementation in that village district originally. So it's not just kind of this philosophical zoning sometimes is used as an exclusionary tool. It happened, in a lot of places in the early 1900s, even the mid 1900s. Now we're trying to get away from that. And I think that that's great. So Lee J talked about kind of the three main pushes of 2003 were to kind of remove those, home rule abilities of municipalities to put things that are deemed detrimental to the housing stock of the entire state. So we've been looking at that here. I think it's great. For the most part, York was in a really good place with a lot of the progressive, the ordinances and the standards that were in place. The density issues are good. I don't think there's any changes, or there's some minor changes that were needed to meet that. ADUs are the biggest one that kind of have been batted around that we do need to make some changes on to become compliant with 2003, LD 2003. And there was an active process this fall. The planning board made some recommendations to the select board. There was a lot of deliberation, got pushed back. The planning board is going to be looking at it again over the winter. And the goal is that those will be back in front of the voters kind of in the spring to adopt in advance of that June deadline. So looks like we will have the ability to meet it. But there were some good topics that came up during those discussions, both at the planning board level and the select board level. There were so the main issues are that the minimum size, there is a minimum size that varies by district in York, and I think that needs to drop to comply with the tiny house laws and the provisions that have been put in state law. And the ADUs have to be exempted from the density requirements, which we wouldn't comply with LD 2003 there. But, just kind of as an overview, a lot of people might not know what ADUs are, or you probably do now because we've been talking about them, but accessory dwelling units. So it's something that's essentially accessory. It's subordinate to the original use on the property. So if there's a residential house, it's a housing unit that is smaller and looks subordinate to. So it's not like the primary residence on a property. It looks like an accessory to the original use. They're allowed everywhere here in town, which is great. We do have the 50% 750 square foot rule. So the maximum size is that they can be 50% of the housing unit. So if you have a 2,000 square foot house, you could in theory have a 1,000 square foot ADU. However, it's also capped at either 50% or 750 square feet, whichever is greater. So, or whichever is less, sorry. So that would limit larger houses. You would be limited to a 750 square foot ADU. If you have a small primary structure, less than 1,500 square feet, it would be half of that. You'd be allowed to do it. They are required to be owner occupied, but our ordinance doesn't specify which unit, whether the accessory or the primary, has to be owner occupied. That is something that was discussed between the planning board and the select board review that happened later this summer, earlier this fall. I guess we're still in summer, so later this summer. There is a question of whether that's going to continue or whether they could be not required to be owner occupied. A couple examples that were brought up are what if your primary residence is somewhere else and you keep the ADU for a vacation home, you're still not going to be, necessarily renting out 2 units. You're only going to be renting out the primary house, or maybe you keep the primary house and you rent out the ADU. But it would require, the way it's currently worded, would require it to be a year-round resident, or at least your primary residence would have to be declared in York. So don't have any indication which way that one's going, but it is under discussion right now and will be an active discussion moving forward into the spring. So that might change. The minimum size was discussed pretty extensively. Do we have a minimum size at all? Is it 190 square feet, which is the state, the state minimum there? Is it some other amount that is closer to the numbers that we have now that are done by district? So we don't have a firm direction that's going, but that's being discussed at the select board and planning board level. And then the real maximum sizes was discussed as well. Sorry. So is 750 the right number? Is it 1,000? Is it 800? Is it 1,200? Is there no real maximum number? Should it just be 50% of the total square feet of the primary residence? So that's another item for debate. And then the real big issue is short-term rentals. And this kind of gets back to owner-occupied, but I think there is hesitance on the part of a lot of people, town officials, to not just approve something that's going to allow a lot more short-term rental units to get built or permitted or become legal and then flood the market, because that's something that we've identified that just doesn't help the long-term housing affordability, right? Because people can get $5,000 a week or $4,000 a week for 10 weeks, and then they don't care what happens. Maybe you get a winter rental in there, but it doesn't really matter when you're making $4,000 a week for 10 weeks. You're making your money in the spring, so you have no motivation to really fill that unit in the fall. So they're separate questions, but there is going to be a conversation going forward. I know that the planning board and the planning department has been tasked with reviving the ADU conversation, the short-term rental conversation here in town, and bringing something forward potentially in the spring for consideration. So that was on a lot of people's minds, I think, during the discussion, both at the planning board and the select board level. Like, whatever we do, we're looking at it through a lens of, is this going to just enable more short-term rentals and not help the underlying affordability question? So, yeah, and we talked about the ARU, the accessory residential unit. I think those are really great in certain circumstances, but they're limited in duration to when somebody has a documentable issue that meets the standards in the ordinance. So the bad part is they're not permanent, so it wouldn't, it does a lot to address specific family situations in a, very in a great way, really. If you've got a family member that needs, taken care of or needs permanent assistance on a regular basis, but long-term affordability wise, if that situation goes away, the ability for the ARU to exist also goes away. So it's not a long-term affordability boost. It's just like it helps deal with specific family situations usually, or healthcare related situations. So yeah, I mean, I'm really interested to hear any questions, but just the whole conversation. We've got a lot of open moving parts right now here, and wish I had hey, this is what's going to happen. This is what's going to be in front of voters in November, but it looks like it's going to be a May of next year conversation that we're going to be having. So stay tuned to the planning board and the select board process and over the winter, and there should be some interesting questions on the ballot next year that directly relate to affordability in these key provisions here.
Thank you, Peter. Appreciate it. And yeah, I always felt like York had a pretty good ADU ordinance for a while there, and adopting LD 2003 wouldn't be that far a reach, but without the guidance from the state, it would be difficult. So I'm glad to hear this is a continuing conversation to see it come about in the spring. One of the questions we did receive, and I'm not sure if we'll be able to answer it. I know in Kittery, they have grants available that folks are using to build ADUs. And they also have a housing reserve fund as well. Some of the questions that had come in were about York potentially having any incentives or ADU grant money available. And also if the short-term rental rules apply to ADUs the same way. And I could probably speak a little bit to the short-term rental rules as far as your parking, your trash, those kind of items are critical.
Yep.
But,
Yeah,
go ahead.
I'll take a stab at both of them. The first is no, there's not that program that exists currently in York, but there are a lot of municipalities, there are a few throughout Maine that are looking at that. I've seen a couple, I want to say up in central Maine. I don't want to quote them because I'll get it wrong, but in the Lewiston, Auburn area, I think a few of them were doing the same thing, incentivizing in some way, whether, you know, it's a tax break or they're paying you if you keep it affordable for a certain length of time. There are a few crazy ideas that are being considered that might actually work. But the grants are another way that some municipalities are looking at. So we can do it. The programs do exist. It is something we could look at. It hasn't been brought forward, but it may be in the near future, judging from the sound of if there's people out there that are interested, the conversation may start up. But the rules, so the current, I guess the current rule on short-term rentals is that, you know, they're not specifically called out. So we don't have provisions that allow them. They're specifically prohibited short-term rental ADUs being used for short-term rental purposes in the ordinance currently. I don't think that there's a 100% enforcement ability of that on our end right now. But as we go through potentially adopting short-term rental regulations, they would apply. It wouldn't make a difference. I guess that would have to be, we would have to first allow ADUs to be used as short-term rentals. And then if that was the case, they would be the same as any other dwelling unit. But it looks like if nothing changes, that the prohibition would stay in the ADU ordinance. We're not, that wasn't considered in any of the proposals that we looked at this fall to remove the short-term rental prohibition to allow ADUs to be used as short-term rentals. Just the owner-occupied part was kind of under consideration. So it's kind of, they're conflated. They're both being considered at the same time, but they are two separate kind of answers. In terms of building code and what do you have to build an ADU to, it's the same as any other residential unit. So you have to meet the same fire safety, life safety, building code if you're constructing a new ADU as if you were constructing a full-size house. So.
And speaking of that, I know there are some funds available, grant funds and organizations that are interested in assisting with those, whether it's be retrofitting space. And I know there's climate groups and energy efficiency groups looking to get into that conversation about how they can help with those retrofits. And I know there are also, as much as there aren't, for say, ADU incentives explicitly in York, we do have some landlord incentives and some other avenues that if folks wanted to rent, be happy to discuss that too. There are incentives for that as well. And on a final note, I think the vacancy rates would be extremely interesting to note in Southern Maine, and particularly in York, where we have a lot of these short-term rentals that are maybe undocumented, to show that we do have a lot of housing units. They're just not being utilized maybe the way that we could be better at housing folks in town. So no one has volunteered the vacancy rates on some of these Airbnbs, but I'm still looking for it. And if I can find some information, I'd be happy to share with the group to help with that discussion. Thank you so much, Peter. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Amber. Thanks, everyone. I'll stick around if.
Thank you. Next, we're going to move to Christine Bennett, and she's going to talk a little bit about Eliot and what they've been up to. Thank you, Christine.
Thanks, Amber. And gosh, this is a great conversation. Really learning a lot from Lee J and also from Peter about LD 2003 in York and what you're doing. I've just prepared a slideshow that I was going to share with everyone because I've been presenting, seems like more and more, what Eliot's been doing at the planning board level. I am the chair. And we're trying to refine a PowerPoint that we can then put on our website to inform our voters, because we will be going forward with our proposed ordinance in compliance with LD 2003 in November. We did a little piece in June. We want to finish it up in November. So anyway, I will share my screen, and it's asking again. Okay. Am I doing it right, Amber? Awesome, thank you. Okay, so this is a very wordy introduction, and we could just go forward to the next slide, but if I can, okay. So what we've been doing on housing. So we had been talking about finding unique solutions to the housing crisis in sort of organically in Eliot when LD 2003 came onto the scene. I am a member of the Maine Municipal Association Legislative Policy Committee, so I've been aware of this legislation in detail for a long time. Eliot's ordinance was relatively compliant prior to the statute. We have taken a nuanced approach to the additional requirements that we need to do to meet this mandate. I know some communities have throughout the state who have just taken the statute and tried to plug it in and haven't been as successful. This is not like shoreland zoning where you can default to the state's statute. This is something where each community has to incorporate it into your land use ordinance. And along the way, we've identified a number of areas where we will consider future refinements to what we're proposing in November. And I'll just say that we've had an ADU ordinance since 2003. It has changed along the way as far as minimum size, maximum size. Are we going to make it proportional to the principal structure? But we went a step further in June, and we have created an ordinance that allows for accessory structures, old barns, sheds, whatever you have, that they would be allowed to be converted into an accessory dwelling unit. We really do see this as the ADUs as a really low-hanging fruit and a great tool to provide housing. So that passed in June. We've already done that. Some of the things that we had to put aside in order to address the LD 2003 compliance was that we were looking to our neighbors like Kittery that have a cottage cluster ordinance, and sorry, second meeting, and also creating an allowance for duplexes. We are thinking about amending a portion of our commercial industrial zone to allow for multiple uses, i.e. allow residential uses within our commercial industrial zone, which if anyone, only Eliot may be familiar with this, or Lee J, is Route 236. So on an active transportation network. So, and then active municipal engagement in trying to provide some housing opportunities. We have just begun to acquire tax acquired properties. We have 4 now. One of them might be a really great fit for one of these multiple uses properties. And then also having to think about some new tools to protect sensitive natural resources besides dimensional standards. Specifically our rural zone, which is within the Mount Academicus to the Sea actually has 4 conservation focus areas, state, federal, local, all overlap in our rural zone. And we're using 3-acre zoning really, and dead end road length to, and they're imperfect tools. We need to think about other methods to do that. So ADUs in all, we have always allowed ADUs in all residential zones. So we just needed to do a little bit of refinement. We had to bring the minimum size down to 190 square feet. We have needed to now go back and make provisions that where we can allow accessory dwelling units in certain portions of the shoreland zone. We are going to be disallowing them in stream protection and resource protection per DEP's advice. This is relates to the LD 1706 that Lee J had mentioned that made some refinements to LD 2003. One of which is that shoreland, you can't use shoreland zoning to prohibit, but shoreland not silent. Shoreland zoning is not silent about accessory dwelling units. allowing for this increased residential density, we were largely compliant already. We need to, but in that we haven't done the exclusionary zoning piece of saying, okay, 1 acre for a single family home. You want to do a second single family home? Oh gosh, you're going to need 4 more acres to do that. We don't want, instead of that, we've been very proportional in all of our zones. We haven't had to make any amendments to that. Each additional unit, dwelling unit only requires as much as the first additional dwelling unit. The one thing that we had to do was we had to actually formally designate a growth area to accommodate the requirement within the statute that in such zones, you on a vacant lot, you by right can add 4 additional dwelling units. Took a little finagling, not a big deal, really, honestly. Affordable housing developments was our biggest lift. We weren't really compliant. We had an allowance for affordable housing in our community. We had a definition. And the only incentive we gave was through our growth permit system. So we are still a community that has a growth permit system. So LD 2003 requires that, as Lee mentioned, a 2.5-time density bonus for eligible developments. As I said, we've had an ADU ordinance since 2003. We lowered the, I think I've already hit all of this. The allowance for the, I think I will just throw this out as maybe a tool for other communities to think about. And not just because I thought of it or it was suggested by someone within our community, but we're allowing the for conversion of accessory structures, which by our dimensional standards have lesser sideline setbacks into accessory dwelling units. And then we incorporated language to address the prohibition of creating more non-conformance on the lot. So we're happy to share what we wrote. It's a little too wonky and technical, I think, for most people. So with the residential density, our comprehensive plan was written in 2009, just as the housing financial crisis was happening in our country. Building just went down to nothing. We had, the Great Recession. At the time that it was drafted, 2007, 2008, the assumption was that our village district, which already has some sewer, the town would be investing in expanding the sewer to encompass all of the village district. And at that time, we would lower our minimum lot size in the district from 1 acre to a 1/2 acre. That never happened. The investment, we only have limited sewage. We have water throughout the village district. We do not have sewage, a sewer. So 2003 came along, we were in this gray zone, and we were advised that we do have a designated growth zone. We just hadn't formalized it in our ordinance. So that's what we are doing at this time. We are also going to be lowering the minimum lot size for those lots that are served by sewer to a 1/2 acre. So we're kind of implementing our comprehensive plan late. But this is meaningful when you talk about this residential density and the allowance for up to 4 additional units. Affordable housing developments. As I said, this was the heaviest lift for us, took the most time to consider. We struck our definition of affordable housing. We had thought about keeping it because it actually had a lower income threshold than what is required by LD 2003. As you see on the screen, and if you use 2021 numbers and our old affordable housing definition, the upper income threshold would be $74,000 a year. It's now been replaced by the area median income, which for our town is Eliot, York, Kittery, South Berwick, of 101 in 2021. I think that's gone up. We did the mandatory, created the 2.5 time density bonus. We asked Department of Economic Community Development for any examples of ordinances that had already passed. And they gave us a list, and we looked at, and I believe it's Kennebunk, might be Kennebunkport, get them confused. They had extensive language about how you ensure long-term eligibility, what the procedure is, and we lifted freely from them, and have incorporated that into our ordinance, because it was like, yeah, how do we figure this out? Who is going to do this? And it's still kind of vague. And I think Amber had a really great point that we should think collectively, or Maine Housing could give us some assistance on, you know, who is going to be contracted to take this for the next 30 years and ensure that these units remain affordable. We had to amend our sewage disposal ordinance to include engineered septic systems. So one of the nuances to a pretty clunkily written statute is that these affordable housing developments are essentially must be allowed anywhere a multifamily unit is allowed, through a variety of different linguistic tricks I won't go into. So a lot of we foresee most of the affordable housing developments that will occur as a result of these ordinance changes will be happening in our suburban zone without the benefit of water, public water, and a public sewer. Because, and DECD just came out with the definition when they did rulemaking, I think the beginning of May, that the comparable sewer system is actually an engineered septic system. So we needed to put that into our ordinance. And then of course, there's a parking requirement, a lesser parking requirement embedded in the statute, that you only can require parking for two parking spaces for every 2 units. Put that in. So some of the things we didn't change, and maybe open for a discussion in the future. We didn't change our standards for multifamily units, and they are, depending on how you look at it, minimal or excessive. We only allow 8 units per building. We require 100-foot separation between each building, and we limit the height to 35 feet, which is 2 stories. There are pros and cons on this. I won't debate that, but what it essentially, the rationale is that we wanted to become compliant with LD 2003, and it may be a lift to get this through the voters in November, and we're going with November, so we have a second shot at the bat in June, at the June election. So we may be amending that in the future. One of the things that we didn't define the comparable sewer systems, Lee may know, because I started calling it SMPDC when this statute first was signed by the governor. Like, what's a comparable sewer system? And I called the Department of Health and Human Services, blah, 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 blah. And it was a vague terminology, appeared nowhere in any statute. And then we went and spent all this time creating a 36-page proposed ordinance amendment, and we forgot to actually define comparable sewer systems. So caught it after the public hearing. We'll go back at it. We do have some questions about whether our ADU ordinance, which limits ADUs for only single-family residents, is actually compliant with LD 2003. I mean, should we, if there is a 2-family unit, should we be allowing an accessory dwelling unit for that? Should each one get an accessory dwelling unit? And we've got some questions on how this 4 units, up to 4 units on a vacant lot in a growth area works with subdivision law. Yeah, LJ's nodding his head. Yeah, there's some disconnects. And I think the legislature doesn't understand the cascade of different land use statutes that actually exist. We only went with requiring a mature. Oh, so we're also thinking, we had a discussion, but we didn't put it in. And I really think I'm going to advocate for this, that requiring not only a majority of the units be affordable, but requiring a majority of the unit types be affordable. Because I could foresee an affordable housing development coming in, and all the 500 square feet units, all the studios are the affordable units, and the one, 2 and 3 bedroom units that are really suitable for families. Those are going to be the market rate ones, and we know that those aren't attainable for most young families. And we are considering some minimal design criteria for these affordable housing developments. That's going to take a real conversation, but we wanted to just facilitate the gentle incorporation into a suburban landscape, suburban bordering on rural landscape. So, similar roof lines, facades as single family residents, and, something like, screening of mechanical units, because there'd probably be compressors on the roof, those things. So the cottage clusters, we were really going down the road of cottage clusters. And if people don't know what that is, that generally speaking, these are, up to 1,000 square foot residence that is co-located in a cluster with other 1,000 square foot units, oftentimes, sort of around a square or circle, so there's a relationship between these buildings. And then shared space, community space for gathering, perhaps another bedroom if you have guests that want to come, if you want to do some socializing, and also, an accessory structure for shared, lawn care. Some of these kind of moving towards a kind of a co-housing sort of model in a way. But we figured this was sort of the missing middle that we've identified in Eliot. There no longer are 1,000 square foot houses being built, and we need to incentivize these smaller units for moderate income, lower income people at the beginning of their adult life, and the people at the end of their adult life. Also thinking about bringing out creating a definition of duplexes that would allow a conversion of a single family residence to a 2-family unit without requiring any additional acreage. So we're not messing with our dimensional standards as far as acreage are concerned. But, saying, hey, if there's an old colonial that's 3,000 square feet, you can split it up into 2 and have 1,500 square foot units. And we do have a max, I forgot to mention this, we do set a maximum square footage for our accessory dwelling units at 1,000. It was 650 square feet, it's up to 1,000 now. So instead of creating an interior accessory dwelling unit allowing for a duplex, even a 45, even a larger real building, and we have a lot of old ones like that that could be created into a duplex, and seamlessly, silently create new housing units without anyone really ever noticing, except an additional ingress egress. So we're also thinking, we're in the midst of doing updating our comprehensive plan, as Lee J knows. So we've contracted with SMPDC to assist. After we complete the comprehensive plan, we are targeting a rezoning in Eliot, which has not been done. I don't even know when it's been done, but we only have 4 zones. 3 of them residential and a commercial industrial zone. As I mentioned, we talked about adding an overlay or amending that a CI zone to allow for residential uses in the southern portion towards Kittery, end of 236. We're also thinking, I've talked about that, using tax acquired property to also create workforce housing. So one of the things BJ didn't mention about LD 1672, the statute that looks to create a state planning board, basically siting board for accessory housing or affordable housing developments, is that statute as written right now defines workforce housing the same as the affordable housing in LD 2003. And that, in my opinion, is too high. It's not meeting the mark of actually getting towards our moderate and low income citizens. And so we could, I'm hoping that piece gets stricken or revised. I mean, I'm hoping 1672 dies, honestly. Yeah, we would like to create a definition of workforce housing that has a lower income, because, you know, Eliot has a volunteer fire department, and we require that they live in Eliot, and they can't find housing as it is right now. We really do need solutions. We've had you've been in the process of trying to interviewing possible municipal employees who won't come to our community because they can't afford housing. I mean, there's some need. There's a real genuine need right there beyond you know, what it's doing to our economy and our community. And as I mentioned, you know, we still have to consider the environmental protection pieces that we've been using zoning as a tool, and we will continue to, but we've already identified that we need to make some changes to our rural overlay zone, where all of those focus areas of significant concern, environmental protection, and also along the Piscataqua River, because and that may be through an overlay zone, or that may be through amendments to our shoreland zoning, but we have a lot, miles and miles of frontage on the Piscataqua River. We have a lot of our housing there. And across the river, the New Hampshire towns are under a total nitrogen permit, and New Hampshire is talking to Maine about that, and we need to I would like to proactively do that, instead of being Eliot being forced to start building some really expensive sewers. And this is just a personal thought. We have still in our ordinance boarding houses, and at some point it got totally restricted and pulled back. And should we revive this allowance for boarding houses? Because I'm aware of the conversation that had gone on and has gone on in Kittery at the demise of one of the last boarding houses, so maybe we should think about that. Yeah, I think so. Lee, I had a little list of LDs that I'm watching. We're watching carefully LD 1493, which is an act to increase housing affordability by expanding tax increment financing. Our CI zone, multiple uses. It had got amended. It had great prospects when it came out, proposed from MMA, of creating a sales tax free zones where you could, you know, really get at the cost of building housing by allowing them to be built without having to pay sales tax on materials. That part got removed, but it's still held over from last section. LD 1593 is proposing to require, affordable housing and developments in all residential zones, eliminates the minimum lot size rule, eliminates the minimum unit size rule. Seems to be, in my opinion, just going a little too far, pushing on the lever, that we do need some of these things for safety purposes. And yeah, 1672. You know my opinion. So in closing, I have to say that, you know, taking this careful, really surgical look at the Eliot ordinance within the lens of incorporating LD 2000 requirements did reveal some aha moments. You know, all of a sudden it was like, that's why we don't have many affordable housing units being built. The growth permit allowance was just a really ineffective, weak tool. You know, also allowing for multifamily units within 2 over 3 residential zones hasn't delivered housing diversity. From the JLUS study that's going on, the estimate was that Eliot only has 15% rental units. Everything else is owned single family homes. Eliot's NIMBY. I think that also, you know, Peter didn't speak to this, but I think that also LD 2003 was trying to get rid of this NIMBY, not in my backyard. Well, actually you did, Peter. I'm sorry about the campgrounds in the village zoning. Yeah, I think it's real, and it's characterized by our historic identity as an agricultural town. Okay, people can laugh at us all you want, but we were an agricultural town at one point, and there's deep roots and pride in that identity, and it's reflected in our ordinance. The reality is that we are in one of the worst housing markets in New England, and in-migration is accelerating rapidly. And planning for natural resources, I'll just finish off with this little piece, because I do come from my planning. A lot of my planning experience comes from land conservation work, but planning for natural resource protection and climate change is going to be getting more difficult, especially within a legislative environment that's treating housing and zoning for environmental protection as a zero-sum game. They aren't. We just have to do both of them. And one isn't at the expense of the other. And I learned that from working, within 2 land trusts that always said, we are not anti-housing. We will never do conservation where a comprehensive plan states that it is not, housing is desired. We would only work in concert with comprehensive planning, not against it. And a lot of people really got upset when we said, no, we're not going to pursue that property. So thank you. Any questions?
Thank you, Christine. That was extremely informative. And I would echo that same sentiment. The Clean Water Act did a ton for shoreland zoning, but it does make it rather restrictive. And one of the ideas I've been tossing around actually with Peter is applying for a variance that housing crisis is a hardship. And at this point, we should be giving variances on setbacks in municipalities that have more stringent standards than the state. So it's an area that I'm going to pursue. I will let you know how that goes. And as well with the congregate living and the co-housing is an area that we are continuing that conversation and advocating for, and working with Maine Housing on allowing vouchers for those kind of things. We do have the opportunity there. I wanted to close and thank our speakers, all of you presenting, Lee J, Peter, and Christine. Also to Fairtide and YCSA for collaborating on these webinars. And as a reminder, we'll have a recording of this webinar presentation available on our website in our Housing Solutions Library. And although this is our final Housing Series webinar, I would like to invite you to continue this discussion on housing in your own communities. And if you are in York, to consider attending and participating in the upcoming Planapalooza next week, which will include a discussion on housing next Tuesday, September 19th at 7 p.m. at the York Beach Fire Department. And as always, please reach out with any questions or just schedule a consultation with myself on how you can create a rental unit or become a landlord. Thank you all for the advocacy work that you're doing. I appreciate your time. Thank you and take care.